Ilse. Welcome, everyone.
Nice and cozy here today. No, actually, it's really cool as someone who's worked on programming this stage, BetaKit-programmed both the money and the AI stage, to see so many people interested in this conversation today is very heartening, because I think as Vass succinctly laid out in her lightning talk, like, money matters matter, right? So we're going to dig into that today. I've got some really smart people here with me, but I think to lay out this pathway to open banking that we've been talking about, anticipating, waiting for, I got to go through and do some timeline setting. When we did our prep call, I went to these very smart people and I was like, I think we should really spend some time sending some context, digging into what's going on. They're like, absolutely not. Let's get through this as quickly as possible. Let's talk about what we're building, what we're working on next. So I am going to rapid fire lay out the last 5 years of open banking so we can start with what's happening next. So the point that I started, open banking review in budget 2018, which led to the appointment of the advisory committee on open banking September 2018. First review phase and consultations in January 2019, and then, COVID 2020 delayed the second review phase and all the consultations delayed throughout that year. The open banking report was delivered by the advisory committee in April 2021. The government got around to releasing it in August 2021, which we'll get into maybe. Abraham was named the open banking lead in March 2022. We might have reported on that. The open banking working groups began in July of this year. Phase 1 was initially planned for January 2023, but that was on an 18-month timeline that did not start because of delays in finding this gentleman in the report getting released. Abraham's role as open banking lead ends, I believe, around September 2023. Everyone on this panel has played a role or is playing a role in this process, so I couldn't think of a better group to dig into where we go next. I think maybe the best way to summarize all this and get into the conversation, this is something that I've been talking to a lot of people in this space. We cover financial services, FinTech, very significantly on BetaKit. And I was looking for the summation of that rapid fire bullet point. I did my best to condense a lot of work over 5 years. As one FinTech CEO said to me, we have half a decade into this and we're effectively talking about open banking, which, as kind of Vass laid out, puts us behind other countries around the world. So I want to get into specifically the path forward, what's being done. And Abraham, I think I'll start with you because this is your job, man. You're leading this ship.
I love it.
And you're leading the ship as directed by that advisory report. Can we just talk about, you said something that interested me on the prep call, that you're using that report as your roadmap. Can you just talk through the extent to which that's the case? Is that literally the blueprint for what you're looking to build here?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Look, first of all, I'd like to thank the Elevate Festival for giving me an opportunity to come talk to everyone here, standing room. Really impressed. I can sense the optimism. I can sense the interest in this. So again, thank you very much for having me here. As part of my role, I got to tell you, I love this job. Open banking is both a professional and personal passion of mine, so I couldn't be happier to be in this position. Look, with respect to my role and where I take the roadmap from, you're quite correct. The advisory committee report that Ilse was part of lays out a really good roadmap as to how we design this system and we implement it. So we spend a lot of time there trying to address what the key pillars of an open banking system would be, right? What would be the foundation to make sure that we give the market certainty and to make sure that consumers are protected, and at the same time that we increase innovation in Canada. So I take that as my roadmap, as you mentioned, and as the roadmap recommends, we've put together working groups, as you mentioned. We kicked this off in July. We've got 4 of them working on accreditation, as in who gets into the system and on what conditions. We look at privacy. We look at liability, essentially who's on the hook if something goes wrong. And then we look at security, a really hot topic, given everything you read in the news. So everything that has to do with information security, cybersecurity. So our 4 working teams are really deep diving into this material, leveraging the work that the advisory committee did in laying out the roadmap. We're taking it a step further in really analyzing the intricate details of each one of these requirements.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting here that when we're talking about the 18th-month deadline for phase 1, that's only half of this. We're really talking about some basic governance standards, accreditation for fintechs or other organizations to get access to the data, and it's really read focused and not write focused. Phase one is also, because things can never be simple, broken into its own 2 phases, split about 9 months each, as laid out by the advisory committee. Maybe also go to you, because again, you've had a hand in this probably at some of the early stages. Do you think that 18-month deadline is still feasible to get to the end of phase one? Knowing it, I think it's pretty clear that January 2023 isn't going to happen, because when Abraham started, that was the initial movement for phase one kicking off. So we're looking at September of next year. Do you think that 18 months is still feasible, and maybe why was that the timeline that you were looking to lay out through the report? A little bit of a mic check.
Just going back to the process, I think with all the delays, the advisory committee really tried to kind of cover 3 objectives, because advisory committee reports often collect dust on shelves. So we tried to first of all center the public policy objective in consumer interest, make really clear that center the urgency and what was happening internationally. Frame some of the complexity. This is not a simple process, so try to identify the roadblocks in that pathway, and then really urge the government to commit to a timeline, because I think what the industry needs more than anything is visibility on when this is going to be implemented, given that we've been dangling along. So those were the sort of 3 things we were trying to do, but also be very pragmatic with a set of practical steps, which I think is why Abraham is talking about it this way. I'm not close enough to see the progress, but now that we have somebody who is knowledgeable and whose job this is, and who has a timeline of his own, I'm optimistic. But it's only going to work if everybody really digs in and contributes to this process and make it work as efficiently as possible.
Okay, and I think we're gonna break down some of those components and start talking about what's been worked on, what's next to be worked on, because again, some of these things are really big, really important, but I think maybe obfuscated, not only just for Canadian consumers who aren't used to what this offers, but as vast as I know, maybe competition in general. I strongly suggest you check out our op-ed that was published in BetaKit this morning, based upon the report that was released. It might not be news to you, but it should be something that all Canadians are thinking about. Sue, maybe let's get you in before we go back to Abraham, because I think you have a broad industry perspective here. You talk to lots of people. You work with lots of people through Fathom. You also have a really great newsletter that I suggest everyone subscribe to. That's how I keep up to date. Do you have a sense that the timelines are feasible, or do you have a sense that that people are confident that the timelines are feasible? Or what's the worry? Because Abraham doesn't turn into a pumpkin in 18 months, but effectively this thing has to stand on its own when he's gone to move forward, right?
Right. I want to give some context to, the whole industry, just a couple of data points, and then I'll answer that. So some of you may know we have about 2,000 or so fintechs in the Canadian market. And we often talk about 2008. I just picked 2010. Before 2010, we had 641 of those, and I probably worked for 4 of them. So companies like SimCorp and Broadridge and others who service financial institutions. So the competition really started kind of, 2008, post whatever. But after 2010, we've seen 1,500 fintechs start in Canada, either come here from other countries, get their start here. There's many of them here. Borrowell, I saw. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's quite a few here.
They're on stage later today.
Yeah. And just to give you some context too, the fintechs pre-2010 employ 138,000 people. That's a big, if you put it in the context of our big banks who employ 400,000 people, that's a pretty sizable number. All of those companies are trying to figure out how to innovate and transform along with their customers, or invest in open banking technology. And the 1,500 FinTechs employ 40,000 people. So, we've got like roughly half of the size of the banks in our FinTech community. And I don't even know how much money has been invested in them, but even that probably is, a ridiculous number in the billions. And so, when we look at the employed population of Canada with 15 million, FinTechs are 1.2% and banks are 2.6%. And I say all of this because, and I'll just mention one more thing which I think is important. EQ Bank, which is one of Canada's largest banks, started in 2013, has 45 billion in assets and 1,200 employees. So anyone who studies the banking space would know that any other bank of that size has 3 to 4 times that many employees. I'm raising all of this because we're past the point where FinTech is a what if, and are people adopting FinTech? They very much
that point
are.
was like 2015 at the latest.
So I guess my answer is in that context, right? Because I think as someone who studies the space and wants to help companies innovate in the space, this matters a lot. And there's a lot of companies that are spending a lot of time and money on trying to figure out what open banking is going to do to the industry. When I look at the current process with the working groups, my concerns are a few just black and white ones. One is when you look at the timeline, so phase 1, which is broken up into 2 9-month chunks, and then phase 2, which is the second 18-month chunk. And as Douglas said, we should get to the end of the first 18 months by September next year. I look at what incredible work has been done and would not want Abraham's job, even though I thought about it. But I look at the work that has been done and I'm worried. Like, we have 2 to 3 working group meetings per working group that have happened, and we have 6 or so more to go. So that's gonna take us all the way to December. So if we do the math, that's our first 9 months. By the end of the first 9 months, the advisory committee said, you should have the common rules figured out, you should have the technical standards figured out, you should have a legislative review figured out so that by the government, so that we can actually make sure that we understand what needs to change. And then you should actually have something ready by the end of December that's ready to test. Then all these FinTechs, let's pretend that only 500 of them actually, have some role to play in needing to get data and get data from banks and so on and so forth. They're supposed to start testing to like accreditation and access to the system starting in January.
So you're doing my job here for me. You're laying out all the important things that Abraham needs to lead on.
I guess, yeah, and so my summary is I just think there's an incredible amount of work to do. I'm worried that the working groups don't have the right representation of the FinTech community, which, I mean, if you just do it by size, you should have half the people in the working groups should be new entrants. Right?
Okay, so Abraham, we have to have you speak to this because again, you're you're responsible for this, and it's a lot of weight. I think Sue's made a pretty effective argument for not only since we've covered FinTech in Canada on BetaKit, there's always been the tension between disruptors and incumbents and equal access to seat at the table. There's a couple of things who are like, is the process going to get there in time? The level of transparency. I wanted you to lay out maybe the work that's been done to date. I think Sue talked through some of the timelines that are working on the point. But let's have you bridge that into how you are choosing to balance the desires of financial incumbents who have an invested stake in how the process works now, and the disruptors who are just looking for a seat at the table to provide new services, access to customers, different components, right? Because I think the initial committees that were formed were like much larger when the listening sessions were going on. The working groups are much smaller. How are you balancing those needs, and how are you ensuring that things are staying on track? Are you confident that things are still on track?
Absolutely. And let me speak to the interest of stakeholders with respect to participation. Look, it's no secret that we've purposely kept the working group small. If you compare it to the 2020 consultations where we had about 40 people on the line actually contributing, as well as a lot more listening in, for the goal that we had to really deep dive into these points of accreditation, privacy, liability, and security, we really needed a smaller group to be able to get down to the details, because as the cliche goes, the devil's in the details. Now, we've kept that, we did that on purpose, and we're really getting good outputs on the really specific elements that form part of accreditation and the other working groups. Now, with respect to the representation, I think it misses what you were mentioning in the beginning, balancing interests between incumbents and fintechs. I think you're missing some very other key stakeholders here, which we've purposely included in the working groups, and that is consumers. Because as compared to other jurisdictions that had different policy objectives, ours, the center of which is consumers. And I've repeatedly said this on numerous occasions. So we make sure, let me finish off on this, we make sure that we have good representation from incumbents, from fintechs, from credit unions, another stakeholder, from consumer agencies. So we've balanced their participation in the working group to make sure that no one voice has too much of a voice.
Let me follow up on that, because
Sure.
that leads to a question of transparency, and I know
Right.
that there's been comments made, by Sue, Senator Deacon, who is sitting in the audience and will be on stage later, which I'm incredibly excited about, calling for a greater level of transparency and maybe opening up some of that work so that more people can just be aware of what's going on. I think a lot of the furrowed brows and the tension and the anxiety that I hear when I talk to people about this, I think gets to this point of governance, which I think is a competition consideration. I'll be noted I'm wearing my #FreeBoswell t-shirt if you're interested in that. If you like competition in Canada, email me, I'll get you a t-shirt. This idea of governance is one where if I don't ask this question, I'm going to get hung by the fintech startups that I write about every day.
Yep.
It's the number one thing on everyone's mind, because I
Yep.
think the belief is that if proper governance isn't set up, that they will be left holding the bag.
Yep.
And I'm wondering where governance comes into play, what that looks like, and if you are particularly concerned because you're trying to balance the needs of a broader group, that the work that individual banks are doing, signing private open banking partnerships with the likes of Flinks and otherwise, or the fact that FData or Paytex are starting to release or work on their own government governance reports in parallel, that maybe the group is tight enough for you to get work done, but it's not so big that people are looking to work outside of it. How are you paying attention to that outside work? Are you preparing to roll out governance throughout the fall as a major focus? Like, how are you looking to solve that problem? Because I asked every person I could what I should ask you today,
Okay.
and governance was the number one thing.
No problem. So look, a lot to unpack there. I'd like to start with the transparency bit. From early on, my objective was, as the name implies, to keep this as open as possible. So to that end, we have a great website where we update the outcomes of every single discussion we have. Nothing is kept in private. Everything that's agreed on between the participants, whether we have a consensus or not, shows up on the website. We also have an outline of every single discussion point that we're having from the beginning to the end of our working groups, which, as you mentioned, started in July, and we're expecting to end in December. And we're getting a lot of good traction on that website. So we're going to keep posting everything that comes into these discussions. We post our discussion guides. You can see what specific topics that we're engaging. So when I say we're really going deep into it, I invite you to take a look at our website to see the topics that we're trying to resolve to make sure that we have a safe and stable system. Now, on the question of governance, I'll take you back to the 2020 consultations where we had a lot of discussions on governance. And I'll be frank, there was divergence within the industry as to how this should be managed. But essentially, the general consensus was it should be transparent, it should be independent, and it should be representative of all the stakeholders. So we keep that in mind. As we're doing these 4 working groups, Department of Finance and I have separate streams that we've been conducting since the beginning of my work to look at governance, considering what the discussions were during 2020, as well as everything that is coming out of our working groups, because a lot of those discussions will contribute to it, as well as the technical standards.
That's a great point. Maybe I'll follow up there. Do you think,
Sure.
it seems like and I'll also say, like, when everyone that we talk to at BetaKit also note that throughout this process, they've respected the job that you've been doing. It doesn't seem to be personally directed to you, but more attention as to what's being worked on.
Yep.
Do you feel like that some of those separate stream conversations that you're having with finance, part of this isn't that it's not a lack of transparency of what's being worked on,
Mm-hmm.
it's a lack of transparency on how they're going to get to the next things? Because I know we published a report a couple weeks ago. People were concerned about the fact that governance and particularly the technical standards had not been a part of the working groups
Right.
yet. And I'm wondering if there was more laid out for them in terms of what was coming next that would settle some of the anxiety about maybe not getting done in time.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, the work that's coming out of the working groups is contributing to those discussions. So in addition to the diligence work that we're doing, we're taking the outputs of those working groups. But I'll also mention that in addition to the 2020 consultation, where we had a lot of good points on how governance should be run, the advisory committee report also laid outlines of the policy principle that whatever governance structure takes over will have to fulfill. And similarly on technical standards, right? The advisory committee report didn't state a preference for a specific technical standard, nor did it mention it should be one or the other, but it laid out these policy objectives that any technical standard that is part of the system will have to fulfill. So we are conducting that work as we speak. I'm conscious of what other technical standards exist in other jurisdictions. As part of my job, I'm very actively consulting with my counterparts elsewhere to see how we can learn about what was beneficial to them and where the pitfalls were. So I take your point early on when you were mentioning that perhaps we're a little behind. Well, I think our timing is very opportune, to be frank with you. I'd venture to say that not a single system globally has got this perfectly right from day one. So it's incumbent on me to understand what the pitfalls were, how things went well, and to bring this in. So we are considering all this as we conduct our governance work, as we conduct our technical stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that, but I want to get Ilse in here because unfortunately we are using you as a proxy to represent everyone on the advisory group. So you're speaking for numerous people here in intent, and everyone will understand that that's the case. But I will admit that there are, in the advisory report, there are certain situations that are, I would assume, intentionally broad to allow wiggle room for the open banking lead to make decisions. Are you happy so far with what you've seen in terms of level of transparency, individuals involved, work being done, that it's matching to the vision that was set out with the report or the recommendations?
The reality is that, one of the things you learn when you work on an advisory committee like this with the Ministry of Finance, you realize there are constraints that the people work into. I can just say very clearly here that the Open Banking Secretariat in the Ministry of Finance is absolutely superb and is massively committed to getting this right. I think they're very concerned, and I think Abraham probably too, is getting this right is probably more important than 18 months versus 24 months. So.
Okay.
So that's another point. I would just say on the governance issue, it was front and center because there was a fork in the road if you look internationally. There was either going to be a system that was the heavy hand of government dictating, or there was the free-for-all where industry would make all the rules, which effectively would hand this over to the banks. We chose a middle road where we said all the actors would come together and design a made in Canada solution that puts consumers at the center, and that governance is critical, but form should follow function. And that government has a critical role to play and should not hesitate to step in if the players don't play ball. So that is very much in the report, and I think is out there. And, I can't comment on Abraham's approaches there, but, I just think this is a system that is here for everybody to design together. And it's our choice to get it right. And governance is critical and must be one of those pieces that's right.
Yeah, to the heavy-handedness and maybe to bring this out to broader markets, I think that if you look to the UK right now, there's a lot of reports coming out end of last year. They're actually looking to fine banks for not being cooperative and working to provide value to the customers, and I think Standard Chartered Bank was just fined £46 million. It's a lot of pounds by the PRA for kind of failing to do that. Not necessarily purely along open banking lines, but again, consumer benefit, cooperation are kind of in line with the intentions of open banking. Just one follow-up to Ilse before we go back to this idea, I'll go to Sue in terms of like the 18 months to 24 months because FinTechs will still be around whether or not things are fully settled. Did it burn you a little that you submitted your report as kind of quickly as you could and then it sat on Finance's desk for like most of the spring and summer before it was released? That kind of slowed things down a bit, didn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had frustrations all the way along. There was an election, then there was a pandemic, there There was a lot of frustrations along the way. But let me just be clear. You know, the delays were not the fault of the advisory committee. It was not the fault of Abraham. It's not the fault of the Open Banking Secretariat. So I think we just have to look forward now and make this work.
Okay. So, Sue, I want to get you in here because I think this idea of can we meet the timeline? Can we get the work done? Maybe the middle road approach is a good way to look at it and striking that balance. I think one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot is what happens if developments are made privately between financial organizations that aren't willing to wait. Like some form of open banking exists in Canada already. It's just not an open banking infrastructure. We've been calling it private open banking. There are individual deals. National Bank has a majority stake in Flinks. Like there's stuff being done. How do you feel when you talk to all the players in this space and do work with them? How that's going to merge with the work that Abraham's leading? Is there going to have to be kind of like a come to Abraham moment where they're going to have to align to the work that he's doing? I'm sorry, I apologize for that. It was the worst. Are we going to have dual track open banking in this country going forward? Like, what is it? This is a country, by the way, that like we have relied on Interact for a lot over the last 2 decades. We're not familiar with kind of multiple systems for this stuff.
Yeah. Is that the number of seconds I have to
We're going to go 2 minutes over. That's fine. I programmed the stage.
Well, I mean, I actually think a lot of the announcements are red herrings. Yodlee and MX have been in the Canadian market for over a decade. Yodlee was how formerly ING Direct, now Tangerine, actually opened accounts in Canada 20 years ago. And so I think some of these announcements are actually more about data and analytics. Like CIBC has an amazing new insights capability that, as a customer, I love. I think we need to make sure we don't forget about small businesses, because on that note, that is a very, very, very broken situation for any small business to get a loan, open a bank account,
might be moderating a panel on that around 11 o'clock at this stage if you're interested.
Sync their accounting software. Like our bank cuts our accounting software off every day. So I think I'm happy to see some of these aggregators help the banks. I'd like to think, because it would probably be more newsworthy, that they're actually planning to do open banking with an aggregator. The reality is, those in the industry know that that's not even possible, right? So I think the investments have long been made in aggregators. I think that back to the issue, because I know this is probably my last opportunity to say something. I mean, Abraham is one person, and the Open Banking Secretariat is, I don't know how many people. Let's pretend it's 10, maybe 5 to 10. What I worry about is that maybe this isn't the only way to do this, right? Like, could we put more resources on it at a government level? Could Abraham have a peer that represents, that either helps him or represents the other
Extend
part
this guy's
of the
contract
community?
for another 18 months, maybe.
Well, because God, like, he's not God. He's not superhuman. Like, he's a person, and he can only do so much. And, if you read anything about innovation, the hardest part of innovation in a big company is asking the people who are doing the jobs today to reinvent their jobs.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is one of the fundamental drivers of the disconnect with, when I look at the accreditation criteria on the working group website, like, anyone here, don't go look at it if you're a FinTech, because it'll freak you out. Like, it is ridiculous. It is, like, to the nth degree risk. And, countries other than us have managed to figure this out without having giant, disasters and systemic risks.
Okay.
So, anyway.
Duly noted that Abraham is not superhuman, but he is going to have the final word, because I think we've all acknowledged here that you are doing a very difficult job balancing a variety of factors that are either within your control or not within your control. Just give this audience, like, how do you want to, is it a commitment to see this process through? Is it a commitment to deliver? Like, I just speak to these people. What do you want them to take away from this process?
Look, I think
Can we cut the music, sorry? Yeah, I'm going to...
I'll make it fast. Ilse
Yeah.
said it right. The importance here is to look at the future. We've dedicated a lot of time and resources to really look at the intricate details and all the ways that we can protect consumers. Because lest we forget, the objective of our policy here, the objective of Canadian open banking, is to put consumers in the middle. So let's keep this in mind. And I promise you we'll have something that globally we can be proud of and will be an accelerant to our system here.
Awesome. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you speaking to this, and just looking forward to continuing the work. Okay, this is our first kind of kickoff session today. There's going to be more conversations around this. Thank you so much. We worked so hard to program this stage. We are trying to get more seats for the people outside. Thank you for showing up.